Well, I think the fact that the room has gotten a little bit quiet means that everybody's ready to start the meeting. So I've gotten the signal. Good morning, everybody. I'm Marty Baumann, as I think you know, the PCAOB's Chief Auditor and Director of Professional Standards. I'd like to welcome everyone here to the meeting of the PCAOB's Standing Advisory Group, especially the members and official observers of the SAG, those that are here, as well as those joining by phone today. Lynn Turner could not make the meeting, but I believe Lynn is on the phone. Is that right, Lynn?
Yeah, it is, Marty.
Ah, good. You're coming through loud and clear. Just in case we were concerned we couldn't hear you. I'd also like to welcome those others attending here, other guests and observers, as well as those listening in and watching via the webcast. For those here, you'll notice a little difference in the room layout, maybe from past meetings. And know there was not a wedding here last night, and they were not able to change the tables in time. So that was somebody suggested to me. We just wanted to show our willingness to experiment and change. We thought that possibly this layout might be a more collegial way of talking to each other. Individual tables could develop views on issues and get back to us rather than have a group tent card that you could put up and give us your thoughts. We're also, for this meeting, we're also having a number of breakout sessions later on. And we've laid out the materials that will be discussed in those breakout sessions. So we'll be interested in your feedback not only on the content of the meeting, ultimately, but also what you thought about the different, the layout of the room, the use of breakout sessions, and things of that nature. Let me just talk about a couple of things in front of you, aside from us. You have an agenda for the meeting in your materials. You have a copy of our updated standard setting agenda, copies of the briefing papers for this afternoon's sessions, and some other information about the breakout sessions, such as which group you're in, etc. The briefing papers were previously distributed and have been posted to our website for all to see. As always, we welcome strong involvement and comments and questions throughout the meeting by all of the SAG members. In that regard, just as a reminder, whenever you want to make a comment at any time, just place your name, tent card, on its edge, and we'll recognize you. Just one other reminder, and that is, when you want to speak, you also have to press the white button on the speaker in front of you, and then when you are finished, if you could kindly press the button again to turn it off. If there are more than 3 buttons, apparently something happens, and none of us can hear each other. The protocol with respect to tent cards will not be followed in the breakout sessions. It'll be more kind of street rules. So conversation will be lively, debate lively, discussion across the table, and so there won't be that formality will not exist in the breakout sessions. Taking a quick look at the agenda, meeting agenda in front of you, you'll see that this morning we'll soon turn to Chairman Doty for a general PCAOB update, and then back to me for a discussion of our standard setting activities. After that, we'll introduce the 2 main topics to be addressed at this SAG meeting, the first being the auditor's reporting model and consideration of a possible approach to that auditor's report. And there's a briefing paper discussing that. We've discussed the auditor's reporting model a number of times at this meeting. Obviously, we've had roundtables and concept release, but here we're talking about a specific possible approach, and we want to get views on that approach at that breakout session. The second breakout session will deal with consideration of outreach or research regarding the auditor's approach to detecting fraud. That topic digging much deeper into a topic we began discussing at the last SAG meeting. At the last SAG meeting, we laid out some other possible topics for the SAG to discuss. Many of the topics on our current standard setting agenda have been discussed for many years by SAG members, and we're proceeding with standard setting based upon a lot of input we've received at those meetings. So at the last meeting, we laid out, well, what are we going to talk about in the future, in addition to just updating you on our progress on those different standard-setting matters. One was the auditor's responsibility with respect to fraud. And there was as you may recall, there was pretty wide support for additional dialogue on that subject. So what we want to do with the breakout sessions today is really dig into, well, what is that? What exactly do we want to do in terms of SAG task force, other types of outreach, roundtables, who should be involved, what should the topics be, et cetera. So we're really looking to try to get much more deeper into the what, who, and how if we did something on that subject. As I said, this afternoon we'll have the breakout session on those topics, much smaller groups, and so everybody should have an ample opportunity to comment and give us their views on these two most important topics to us. Your folders indicate which breakout session you'll be in. I'm sorry to say for the public, the breakout sessions are not open to the public. However, tomorrow morning we will have reports back to the full SAG about key points from each breakout session on each of the subjects. So there'll be a report back from Group A on the audit reporting model, Group B on the reporting model, and other members of the SAG who participated in those discussions will be encouraged to comment on those reports with respect to how we characterize the comments made and emphasize any points that you think need further emphasis. So we'll have a report back, but hopefully active dialogue again from the SAG members as to what you think you heard in your session, and then later on kind of a debate across the topics as to different points that may have been raised in different rooms and different views about that. So there will be a thorough ability for the public to hear what happened in those breakout sessions. Before I turn things over to Chairman Doty, I'd like to make a brief comment about standard setting, which I'll explore in greater depth after Jim speaks. The board's rulemaking has historically involved certain elements of economic analysis, including steps to describe the need for the rule, consideration of advantages, disadvantages, and unintended consequences of proposed rules, an analysis of how the rule satisfies the PCAOB's statutory criteria of protecting the interests of investors and furthering the public interest in informative, accurate, and independent audit reports. Since early this year, since early 2012, we have been exploring ways to further incorporate economic analysis in each stage of the board's rulemaking process, including at the project development stage, during the comment period, and post-implementation, commensurate with the potential significance of the rule under consideration. While this work was underway, the Jumpstart Our Business Startups Act, or JOBS Act, became law on April 5th, 2012. The JOBS Act amended the Sarbanes-Oxley Act in part as follows, and quote, "Any additional rules adopted by the board after the date of enactment of this subparagraph shall not apply to an audit of any emerging growth company unless the Commission determines that the application of such additional requirements is necessary or appropriate in the public interest after considering the protection of investors and whether the action will promote efficiency, competition, and capital formation." So the JOBS Act required a new, very specific economic analysis to be performed. It also created a new set of companies, emerging growth companies, to be considered in connection with any new rulemaking. We worked very closely with the SEC staff in considering the type of data and analyses we would provide the Commission to aid them as they approach this new JOBS Act requirement for the first time in connection with AS-16, Communications with Audit Committees. AS-16 was adopted by the Board on August 15th, 2012. Subject to approval by the SEC, the standard is intended to apply to audits for periods beginning after December 15th, 2012. It was adopted on August 15th, expected to be applied to audits beginning after December 15th, 2012, subject to SEC approval. The new requirements of the Jobs Act clearly had an impact on standard setting this year as we carefully considered its provisions and began to perform the analyses and provide information to help the Commission meet its requirements. During 2012, we continued to work on the many standard-setting projects otherwise planned for proposal or adoption in 2012, but they were delayed as we began to gear up to help the Commission meet these new requirements. As such, you'll see a very active agenda now planned for the first half of 2013. So I'll talk in more depth about that planned standard-setting agenda shortly, but first I now want to turn things over to Chairman Doty for a general update about the PCAOB. Jim?
Thank you, Marty, and thanks to you all for being here, and both as SAG members and observers. I want first to congratulate Marty and the staff of the OCA and his entire team for an innovative and active format. This is a very creative format for these meetings, and it's a change, and we are going to be interested to see whether you like it and how it works. I want to take a few minutes to update you on the things we've been doing. This slot in the program has developed into something of an opportunity of a report card to you from the chairman and the board of the PCAOB, and the Q&A has been a very good thing. But I want to note, of course, that at the outset that I'm speaking for myself, expressing my views on the topics we touch on, and not the views of the institution. As I discussed in May with you, we have a robust agenda, including issues that were raised, outreach issues that came to us through this advisory group, as well as from other standard setters. And in that regard, I want to touch on these. Marty is going to give you a complete update. Briefly, to touch on the Audit Committee standard. That standard, AS16, has been widely received, well received in a wide variety of venues. It's been submitted, as Marty noted, to the SEC for the necessary approval. I think it's noteworthy that we included an analysis of efficiency, competition, and capital formation to assist the Commission and support them in their determination pursuant to the Jumpstart Our Business Startups Act. We believe, I believe, that the standard should be found to be well justified and well supported. I think the AS16, the ECCF analysis that goes along with it is a first one for us in this format, but I think it's good. It's very good, and it points to exactly to the economic and theoretical assumptions that support that standard and have been widely studied and commented on by reputable academicians. We've also issued guidance about how audit committees can learn more from their auditors about the results and the implications of our inspection findings. The goal of that guidance was to better equip the audit committees of public companies and their boards of directors to engage in meaningful discussion with PCAOB registered audit firms about the results of the inspection. The guidance provides information about the meaning, the significance of our inspections in the context of engagement reviews and quality control reviews. It suggests some specific approaches that an audit committee might make or consider for initiating or enhancing their inspection-related discussions with an audit firm. Again, that guidance, I think, has been well received by the audit committee members that we have spoken to and by others in the community. We're considering public comments on proposed new audit standards, most recently on related parties. And Marty is going to discuss that review and the decision-making later this morning. Our standard-setting work, of course, includes two rather broad-ranging projects that were commenced not with concrete proposals but with concept releases. As we've discussed, the audit reporting model several times has been focused on in these meetings. It'll be focused on again. It's a significant part of the program here. And there will be a lot of good information and good opinion coming out of this meeting, I'm confident. We've continued to hold public meetings on the board's concept release on auditor independence and audit firm rotation that we issued in August of 2011. The agendas and the webcasts of those meetings are available on the PCAOB website. And as I've said in the past, the topic is very challenging. My goal has been to initiate and engage a wide range of knowledgeable stakeholders in a deep debate and discussion about this topic. In addition to the 47 panelists who appeared at the two-day public meeting here in March, we've heard from 30 more in San Francisco, 20 more last month in Houston. I believe that these meetings have included some of the most authoritative and experienced voices to address the subject of audit quality, auditor independence, and the challenges to both. They offered varied perspectives as investors, senior executives, and audit committee chairs of major corporations, CEOs of audit firms, academicians, and former regulators. We have a lot to digest in these forums. We're going to see many new projects, I think, grow out of these suggestions that we've heard in the meetings that I've referenced. For example, our release on audit committee use of inspection results was informed in part by the call we heard from audit committee members who participated in those forums and said that they needed more and better information about inspections to oversee their audits. It was especially significant to me that in the recent meetings in Houston, we had the chief financial officers of four major companies, four major public issuers, who endorsed the precepts and the approach of AS16 and of our release on information about our inspection process. I've suggested to Marty that we would be well served by more of these types of professional standards and insights, and I think he is working on audit practice alert on professional skepticism, what professional skepticism is, and how it may be, how auditors should be alert to it. I think you'll be seeing that come along soon. I should add that permeating, as he says, our work on all the standard setting has been an attention to the considerations of competitiveness, efficiency, capital formation. If you go back and look at our releases, there is instinct in them, a recognition of differences between types of issuers, complexity of their business model, and the size of issuers. But clearly, we're going to be investing more in this area, and there will be a good deal more economic analysis we'll be availing ourselves of as we go along. Inspections is a reportable item to all of you. The Inspections Division is led by Helen Munter. Helen and her team have achieved, I think, some very significant milestones this year. First, the interim inspection program for the auditors of broker-dealers has advanced, gathering information to inform our decisions about whether to exempt from the permanent program auditors of different types of broker-dealers. We published a progress report in August of this year about that effort. The report contains information about the compliance and reporting requirements for SEC registered brokers and dealers and the extent to which we found and observed problems in those areas. It includes a summary of the audit deficiencies that we found and identified through only these were the first 10 inspections. Very important. Wide-ranging, very different types of brokers and dealers, but only 10. It was led by Deputy Director Bob Madej. He will continue gathering the information over the course of the program. We're going to be examining 100 firms, probably approximately 170 audits this year in the BD program to develop the factual basis for making the distinctions that we would need to make in a permanent program. Second, non-U.S. inspections have increased this year. The increase was facilitated by the number of cooperative agreements and arrangements that we achieved with fellow regulators in other jurisdictions. The Global Network Firm Program, headed by Senior Deputy Chris Mandelaris, will have inspected 60 non-U.S. affiliates in the global networks that are located in 25 jurisdictions. That increase has facilitated both the inspection of audit multinational engagements as well as the division's focus on the quality control mechanisms that the global network firms used. We're interested not only in the way particular audits were performed across borders, obviously, but also in the quality control that exists in the firm that relates to and impinges on that kind of an audit. The non-affiliated firm program focuses on the smaller firms located both here and in non-U.S. firms that are located elsewhere. That is led by George Bodick, Deputy Director George Bodick. It inspects a variety of audits from shell companies, benefit plans, large operating companies that are located overseas but are triennial firms because they have fewer than 100 audit engagements. In 2012, this program will have inspected 185 firms. 185 firms that are non-affiliates. The inspections program has been active in issuing reports. They've issued 200 reports, completing 250 inspections thus far in 2012. Inspection findings for the cycle are preliminary. Deficiencies continue to be high overall. Inspectors are continuing to see issues in various areas, including, for example, internal control over financial reporting, auditors' responses to the risk of material misstatement, revenue, fair value measuring. I don't think that's a surprise to anyone here. The division anticipates issuing in the near term summary reports on significant observations regarding those deficiencies for the 2007-2010 inspection cycles, and then for another report for internal control over financial reporting. International. You may recall that overall there are 240 non-U.S. audit firms in over 50 jurisdictions that are currently issuing opinions and that are required to be inspected at least every 3 years, at least once every 3 years. To date, we have conducted inspections of around 220 of those non-U.S. firms in 40 jurisdictions. There's obviously a shortfall of approximately 20 firms for reasons that I think you know, but we'll discuss briefly. But this year, 1/4 of our scheduled inspections have been outside the United States. With respect to these jurisdictions, those jurisdictions where we have not been able to inspect to date due to legal impediments, primarily Europe and China, we continue to push forward in our efforts to gain access to inspect in those jurisdictions. In this regard, since we met last May, we have continued to make good progress in Europe, both in beginning to conduct joint inspections in certain EU countries and in concluding or nearly concluding bilateral cooperation agreements in a number of other EU countries, which will allow us to begin joint inspections in those jurisdictions next year. On the inspection front, since May, we've begun to carry out joint inspections for the first time in Germany, the Netherlands, and Spain. We've continued to conduct joint inspections in the UK as well as 2 important non-EU countries in Europe, Norway and Switzerland. On the negotiation front, and this is what I think is going to be interesting to you, and it illustrates the efforts that Bruce Wilson and the OI team, the Office of International Affairs team, have put in. We've concluded at the staff level negotiations on bilateral cooperations with France and Finland. That's right, France, you heard right. We're close to concluding with Sweden, Luxembourg, Belgium, Denmark, Poland, all of which we hope to finish in the next few months, and I think we will be taking up and acting as a board on the French bilateral agreement before the end of the year. We're continuing negotiations with other EU countries and other EU jurisdictions such as Italy, where we need to inspect, although the progress has been slower for a variety of reasons. While we've continued to make good progress in gaining access to inspect PCAOB registered firms in the EU, progress in China, as you know, continues to be slow, but we've had some positive developments. In this regard, in August, we concluded an observation protocol with the CSRC and the Ministry of Finance, and that allowed us to send a team of PCAOB inspectors and OIA officers last month to China to observe the quality control portion of an audit of a Big Four affiliate in China carried out by Chinese audit regulators. The purpose of that observation visit was to build some trust and mutual understanding between ourselves and our Chinese counterparts as a first step toward greater cooperation on cross-border audit oversight and joint inspections. And we'll be following up with our Chinese counterparts very soon. On other international matters, Louis Ferguson and Steve Harris and I were in London in early October for the most recent meeting of the International Forum of Independent Audit Regulators. Lou is doing an outstanding job as the vice chair of IFER. Steve continues to chair IFER's investor working group, doing a superb job in that capacity. IFER provides a useful forum for the exchange of information and experiences among audit regulators. And in London, the FER members for the first time heard the results of a survey that has been conducted of the entire FER membership, which is now 44 jurisdictions, with respect to their most recent findings in each of these jurisdictions. This is a breakthrough. It's the first time FER has done anything of this kind. The findings, the results, which involve some achievement of common taxonomy, common categories for this kind of inspection, should be made public by the end of the year after a final review by the FER membership. And then finally, last week, we successfully hosted our 6th annual International Auditor Regulatory Institute here. It had participants from 37 foreign audit regulators, all of them engaged fully in this process, and it was an all-time high of attendance and interest in that institute. And it was the achievement of the work of a lot of staff members that are in this room. Enforcement matters. I think an enforcement update has to begin, of course, with a reminder that unless agreed by the firm and released by the SEC subject to appeal, unless the SEC has lifted a statutory stay, these are confidential. So we can't talk about the specifics of any of them. But I can say, I think, that since our last meeting, the board announced 7 settled matters against 3 firms and 7 individuals, and that resulted in a range of sanctions: revocation of registration, appointment of a monitor, limitation on the firm's ability to issue some audit reports, especially for China region issuers without certification of compliance from the monitor, some bars of individual auditors for periods ranging from 2 years to permanent suspension. And they involved, among other things, the failure to cooperate with a PCAOB inspection by improperly creating, altering, or backdating audit documentation, violation of AS3. And that I think is the darkest dungeon in the entire enforcement division is reserved for the sin of knowingly altering, and not reporting and not making the required disclosures for the altering of the documents or the file after the documentation completion date. We have cases of partners improperly authorizing the issuance of an audit opinion without conducting any audit work, in violation of Section 10B of the Exchange Act, and we have firm and partners issuing audit reports for China-based issuers without properly supervising the foreign-based audit assistants. And in addition, we've instituted other matters, including audit failures and non-cooperation, that may be litigated. We may be litigating some cases. Outreach, in order to help broker-dealers better understand PCAOB programs, we continue to hold forums on the auditing of smaller broker-dealers. Chicago, Houston, Jersey City, San Diego. Those forums are tailored for the auditors of broker-dealers, and they've been progressively more interactive, including an overview of where we are in the program, such as the one I've given you in more detail, though, and they feature panel discussions and a lot of opportunities to ask questions. They are very much of the nature of continuing professional education. The Forum for Broker-Dealers is an extension of a long-established outreach program for the auditors of issuers in the small business environment. And we had 6 of the 7 small business forums that we've planned already this year. We have 1 more coming up before the end of the year. Jay Hansen and Jeanette Franzel have both provided considerable time and effort in making these outreach efforts a success. They go, they speak, they're invariably very well received, and it's always informative for these auditors of broker-dealers and of small business entities, both in these forums. They also bring audit committee members into the PCAOB to talk to us, and that's useful to us. We're always interested in hearing from the people they meet and see in these small business forums. So that's the busy year we have had so far, and I will, after having questions, I will I'll join my table, but in the meantime, Marty, you're the MC.
I'm sure we'll see a number of 10 cards with comments or questions. And I think I see Denny Beresford and then Joe Carson.
Thanks for the excellent update, Jim. You gave a speech last week, I guess it was, PCAOB regulatory initiatives at the Practicing Law Institute. And in it, you mentioned as part of the inspection program, I'll just read one sentence. Yet we also find explicit policies directing partners to price audits for new clients lower than the cost of auditing for the express purpose of establishing a long-term relationship. That's obviously very troubling. And I was just wondering if you could elaborate a little bit on that. Finding explicit policies, are those actually written policies, or are you inferring policies from practices, and are these for larger firms? Is this widespread or one-off? Can you give us a little bit more flavor on that, because obviously it's a very troubling practice if it's something that's very widespread. Thank you.
First, I'm delighted you noticed it. Second, sitting behind you is the new Director of the Office of Research and Analysis, Greg Jonas, and we have discussed the complexities and the importance of getting to audit quality that is audit engagement that depends on an evaluation of audit quality and not on price. We have been attentive to what we have heard in these roundtables from other jurisdictions in some cases about regimes in which it is thought to be best practice and a good rule if audit committees and boards first select the auditor on the basis of quality and essentially wall off or reserve for later discussion the issue of the price of the audit. I think there are some people, including Dean Beresford, who have suggested in this gathering from time to time that might be a good idea. The statement is well-founded and explicit. We're very careful about characterizing what we see in these general terms. Further than that, I will not go, except to say that I learned from a very wise man, James A. Baker III, never threaten what you cannot prove. And never make a statement like that if you don't have good, solid evidence for it. Evidence that we think would hold up. I'm not making any statement at all about the prevalence of it. In early 2011, we did have evidence in pitches of statements that were made that we thought abridged independence and suggested something of independence. If you consult the pages of the Wall Street Journal, you can sometimes see advertisements that come very close to that line. But the fact is, I think the firms are taking a stronger line or are more interested in avoiding that kind of pitch. But to see it as we saw it in the written pitch suggested to me, a cynical lawyer, that it was probably said more often than it was written. So I think the practice is one that is of concern to all of the firms, the leadership. I'm confident that practice would be of concern to the leadership of the firms. And I think when they start looking at it and looking for it, they will turn to eliminating it. Further offense saith not.
Joe Carzello?
Good morning, Jim, and thank you for that very thorough introduction. As you know, Chinese nationals now have to hold a majority ownership stake in Chinese auditing firms, at least that's my understanding, including PCAOB registered firms. When does a change in ownership require a new registration? And might this change provide an opportunity for the board related to inspections in China?
First, our rules provide for a Form 4 filing if it's substantially the same entity. I don't want to get farther into that. We have one of the real acknowledged experts in this area with us in Paul Gillis, and I'm sure we'll hear more of that in the breakout sessions and during the session. I do think the claim or the utilization of Form 4 gives us some time to consider what the general policy should be toward Chinese firms. But I think that Paul Gillis and others have written clearly about why it's important to get to a result that conforms with law because at the end of the day, we do have a much larger question with 50 Chinese firms registered here in this country. It's a situation which, unless brought into line with the requirements of international audit oversight, which are not only ours now but other countries as well, and brought into the general understanding that is the community of nations now that have these regimes, it's going to create increasing and broader problems than these change of ownership situations represent. We're at a halfway stage with those Form 4 filings.
Bob Hurst?
Thank you. Maybe I should know the answer to this, Jim, but the economic and competitiveness and reports that you do to inform the SEC staff and the Commission on new standards, are those public, or are those?
Yes, they go on the web. They go on our website. And that's why I spoke about what I think is called your attention to the AS-16. I think it makes interesting reading, and you will see more of them as we go forward. Am I in the clear, Mr. Baumann?
Almost. You almost were. And then, not surprisingly, we'd be disappointed if Arnie's card wasn't up. Right, Hainish?
Right.
I wouldn't want to disappoint you, Marty.
Yeah.
Just a quick question. Jim, thanks for the thorough review. You talked a little bit about, these are my words, I think, not yours, the egregious actions, I think, that have been taken by some of the firms. You highlighted a few of the things that you've identified, and actions are being taken. Is there any more context that you can provide around the size of the firms, big firms, small firms, as far as opposed to just sort of, I'll call it, lumping them all into one pot, with
You're discussing the enforcement actions that we discussed involving
yes.
alteration of the files.
Yes.
No, we wouldn't do that for the reasons mentioned. But I think the audit committee of Eli Lilly is certainly in a position to ask whether a firm has had any of those problems, as are other audit committees.
And Damon Silver.
Something better. First, I just want to note that my gratitude for the really impressive array of work that has just been outlined to us, and how interesting and valuable I think this recent exchange here about marketing tactics is from an investor point of view. It's exactly what I think this body was designed to be about when Congress created it. Mr. Chairman, I wanted to express two thoughts about something and ask you a question about something that was raised earlier. I also think that the agenda for this meeting, and I apologize, but the supposed fiscal cliff is going to keep me away from a lot of our session. The agenda for this meeting is equally, I think, central to what Congress created this body for. I think you've put really critical questions in front of us, and I think that the direction that you're pointing in both the major matters before us is absolutely spot on. I wanted to ask you about the brief discussion that occurred by the staff around the Jobs Act. Investors have expressed concern in this body in the recent past, that the Jobs Act, among its many problematic aspects, was the creation of a fragmented public auditing oversight regime. And differing and perhaps incompatible standards applying to different public companies at different stages in their lives and the like. It strikes me that what we've heard so far from the staff confirms the basis for our concern and adds an additional basis, which is the drain on the resources of the board from the regime that's been created here. I wondered if you might be able to further elaborate on that, and I would urge the board to be fulsome in its disclosures to the Commission and to Congress as to what the impact on of the Jobs Act is and will be on the board's ability to fulfill its core functions as designed by Congress.
Well, we first, I think you'll see in the materials on the ARM, we recognize that it's a desirable thing to have one set of audit standards that apply both to emerging growth companies and to other issuers, if that can be achieved. I mean, in our view, there's no presumption that it's better if you have two sets of auditing standards. To the contrary, we are going to be looking at whether or not there are differences in the treatment of audits of certain classes of broker-dealers, because Congress instructed us to do that. As far as the resource allocation, it is, as Marty says, an enhancement of an intellectual information base and analytical base in our organization to have more experienced economists, to have our economists in the Office of Research and Analysis under the chief economist to be focusing on these issues. So we don't see this as a disability. I do think it's important that our analysis begin to be credible, get some deference, achieve some thoughtful response, and it's a very important fact that there will be deliberation internally on what our analysis is. The analysis is not going to provide in all cases one simple answer. So I think that we are at a different stage in standard setting. It will be better informed. Our resources are going to be adequate for it, and we'll continue to work closely with the SEC's Office of Chief Economist and with the kind of building of synergy within the organization that we have between ORA and standards, the Office of Chief Auditor and the Office of Research and Analysis. We're going to learn a lot. And, the best cure for depression and a funk is to learn something new. So I think we're all going to learn something new. But we will keep our eye on the importance of having the standards continue to keep up to date. I know that Jeanette Franzel and Marty and various people, Greg, are all looking at ways in which we can make sure that our standard setting is what we need. And you'll see when Marty rolls out his agenda, you'll see more of that today.
Barbara Roper.
Well, once Damon started talking about the Jobs Act, I can hardly keep quiet. On this issue of cost-benefit analysis, there are a couple of points I'd like to add. One is, if you all could figure out how to do a cost-benefit analysis that can withstand legal challenge, that would be a benefit for a lot of people. So far, we've seen cost-benefit analysis used primarily as something that is a tool to prevent investor protection regulations or to weaken regulations to the point that they're acceptable to the affected industry. And the SEC furthered that approach with its recent so-called cost-benefit analysis, economic analysis in support of its rule lifting the ban on general solicitation in private offerings. This is a rule that weakens investor protections, and the SEC did not feel it necessary even to engage in the pretense of conducting an economic analysis. So one of the concerns we have is that if this is the tool that we're going to have, if we're going to be stuck with this system where we go through this process of economic analysis, it has to apply both ways. And it has to be just as stringent in measuring potential harms to investors from failure to regulate or from weakening regulation as it is in measuring costs to industry from efforts to strengthen regulation. The other piece of that, I think, is that there are a lot of stupid ideas in the Jobs Act, and having different audit standards for different size companies is one of the stupider ones. But the concept that is completely missing from that legislation is that investors who provide capital demand protection. And they impose a higher cost of capital where they're denied adequate protections. And we've seen today, for example, in the Wall Street Journal, we now see companies, we've seen increasing numbers of companies who've chosen not to avail themselves of the various aspects of the exemptions for emerging growth companies precisely because they see a stigma attached with going public under those terms. So I hope that that concept, which was not considered when the legislation was being drafted, will be fully incorporated into any economic analysis of the regulations.
Well, I thought when the Jobs Act was under consideration, I was intrigued to see the Chamber of Commerce, I think, say that they thought that if it was good enough for companies with $1 billion in revenue, it'd be good for Boeing. Interesting concept. It wasn't. It didn't get into the debate, and it's not. It's of no purpose for us to re-engage the debate. My response is that I think the restrictions the Jobs Act puts on us substantively, that is to say, no auditor's discussion and analysis, no mandatory firm rotation, the outright prohibitions it has are simply things that we will be able to deal with and adjust to. We have to protect investors, and I do not see rigorous economic analysis as being inconsistent with investor protection. Indeed, it seems to me that many of the academic centers of economic analysis in our country, Stanford, Chicago, Columbia, Rice, all of these institutions are well stocked with scholars who are objective and who are dispassionate and who know their stuff in terms of what economic literature has given us by way of analyzing legislation and rules, and they're going to have very diverse opinions on all this. And that's why I said to Damon, I think we're going to learn things, but I don't think the heightened profile of real significant economic analysis in rulemaking is going to be something that necessarily at all inhibits protection of investors. And I do think we'll win. I mean, I have no doubt that we're going to do this right, and we will get the deference. We're going to achieve the deference that we should have for the deliberative process and the seriousness of the analysis. That's what we have to do. Mr. Chief Auditor, I think I'm out of here. I'm gonna cross over.
Thanks, Jim. You're welcome to join the group at the table 5. Thank you very much, Jim. So I'll turn back to standard setting and just briefly comment on the last subject that was mentioned by so many of you, and that was the Jobs Act. I commented it in my opening remarks because of the importance of it, and many of you raised questions about it. As I said, clearly, for a good part of 2012, since it was just implemented or enacted on April 5th, 2012, to do exactly what Jim said, to make sure that we prevail and provide rules with appropriate economic analysis, we spent a lot of time studying what that means and building processes, and we are continuing to build processes and skill sets to perform rigorous economic analysis in connection with our standard setting. So each of our teams that are working on the various different standard setting projects that I'll turn to in a second, during 2012, continued to work on those projects, but also started to work within a framework of how to describe the particular problem, how to talk about it from a regulatory perspective, how to think about alternatives, how to think about how that standard and the rule might ultimately affect efficiency, competition, and capital formation. And so we're beginning to build that kind of thinking further into the DNA of all of our people in our standard setting, working closely with our Office of Research and Analysis and Office of General Counsel, and with the board, of course. So with that said, we do now plan to be able to move ahead with the standards that would otherwise have been dealt with in 2012. We think we're positioned to do a lot of that in the first half of 2013. I also want to comment on AS16. Jim has already done that, so I won't say too much more. But we appreciate the generally widespread support for AS16. I know some firms, because they've contacted me, are planning to implement the improved communications with audit committees that are outlined in AS16 into their 2012 audits, even though they're not even required until audits beginning after December 15th, 2012. So I think many firms see these additional requirements, additional communications, and concepts around how to communicate as helpful to a robust process between the auditor and the audit committee. We've heard a lot about that in many of the sessions we had. As a former auditor myself, I believe that audit quality is greatly enhanced by the quality of the communication between the auditor and the audit committee. And I believe AS16 reflects that ability to have that type of communication, sharing audit strategy, the terms of the engagement, greater discussion around matters of like significant unusual transactions, talking to each other about any awareness of challenges or questions about a propriety of accounting in the organization, and making sure that that dialogue is complete, open, frank, and takes place completely before the issuance of the financial statements. So we're looking forward to the benefits of AS16, and like we do with other standards, we will monitor how that is applied. Through our inspections, we can look at the post-implementation in due course. By the way, I do want to remind people again that as I start to go through standard setting here and talk about my agenda, you do not have to wait till I'm finished talking. I'm very happy for cards to go up during my comments, and that breaks it up so you're not listening to me for too long, which I know all of you appreciate. Let me just comment briefly on what I see as, at least I see, and as Jim said, any comments I make are my own and not those of the board members or others at the PCAOB, about our philosophy in standard setting. Our philosophy is for continuous improvements in audit quality by continually looking at audit standards and seeing where they have to be improved. Continually understanding where there are risks in the world of financial reporting and auditing, and putting out important practice alerts that address auditors to the attention of these matters need your particular attention and focus at this particular time in the audit cycle. Jim mentioned our concerns that we're continually seeing around lack of professional skepticism in audits, and our team is working on a practice alert in that regard, which we hope to issue shortly. Turning to the standard setting agenda in particular, which is in front of you, first of all, you should see that it looks different than it did in the past. We have redrawn it to focus attention really on those matters that are of particular near-term events that we expect to occur. All of the items on the standard setting agenda are important. All of them are high priority. But we get to them at different times for a number of different reasons, because of complexity in solving the problem, making sure we fully understand the outcome of that new standard setting, economic analysis, and other factors. We'd like to have all of these issued in the first half of 2013. But we do think we've made a lot of progress on these projects, and so I can talk to them. So we've restructured it to really focus on what's going to happen in the first half of 2013, and our plan would be to say, let's say for instance, in March 31st, 2013, to put this standard setting agenda out again with a look at what might happen, for instance, in the 2Q, 3Q, second quarter and third quarter of 2013. So our interested parties will continually see what's around the corner, what's coming up in the next 6 months or maybe 9 months, if we went out that far. So the goal is to keep your eyes focused on what we're doing and us being accountable to delivering on these things. As I mentioned, certainly we began to put more rigor around economic analysis in early 2012 into our standard setting, and obviously we're continuing to do that because of Jobs Act. We proposed a standard in 2012 on related party transactions that also included amendments dealing with the auditor's responsibilities for significant and unusual transactions, and also included amendments with respect to risk assessment and understanding as part of risk assessment aspects of executive compensation that could lead to inappropriate incentives by executives. We received very positive comments back to improvements in these important areas, largely because so many frauds have occurred where transactions with related parties or unusual transactions to pump up the balance sheet or adjust the financial statements, accounting transactions that had more accounting form than economic substance, and as well as transactions with executives where their compensation created incentives for managing earnings. So we received a lot of positive comments with respect to the proposal. We also received a lot of good suggestions on ways to further enhance that standard. And we've studied carefully every one of those suggestions made by all of the commenters. I believe we received about 37 comment letters in connection with the related parties standard, and analyzed them carefully. And we're moving ahead with a plan to, and I put here adoption or reproposal. Clearly, whether we adopt it or repropose depends on the nature of changes we make to the standard, obviously. If when we finally look at it at the end of the day, the changes are really just to clarify what we already said based upon the comments received, we can move ahead with adoption. If we, based upon comments we made, it's a much more substantive change, then we might think we have to repropose. But I think that decision comes after we put it all together, discuss it with the board and the commission, and conclude on what we do there. In any event, we have put that standard back together as to how we think it should go out, and we'll be making our decision on that shortly, and you should see action on that, as I said, in the first half of 2013. The next item, formerly called codification, is now called reorganization of PCAOB auditing standards. And I've changed the title of this one because we don't have to do, and we're not doing, what was done by the FASB in their extensive and excellent codification project. FASB had many bodies of literature, different levels of gap and hierarchies of gap developed through Emerging Issues Task Force, as well as standards, as well as statements of position, as well as a number of other sources. And codifying that was important into one set of generally accepted accounting principles, all with the same level of authority. We really have one set of auditing standards with the same level of authority, but what we have are standards that were adopted by the board from the profession as the interim standards, labeled as AU in our literature, and standards originally adopted by the board labeled as AS 1 through 16 right now. And the standards that are AS 1 through 16 are just there sequentially numbered in really no logical organization other than the date they were adopted, whereas the AU standards are organized by general standards, standards of fieldwork, standards of reporting. And what we plan to do here is to reorganize the standards such that, and we'll put them together into a group of, may not be exactly the same topics of fieldwork and general standards and reporting, but put them into a logical grouping and integrate the AS standards and the AU standards into one common volume, so it all makes sense and flows through together. We don't expect to do additional rulemaking or changes to standards as part of this. It is really a reorganization, make it much more user-friendly with respect to the profession using the standards, as well as academics and classrooms not having to wade through a couple of different sets of the interim and permanent standards, but putting them all together. We've worked on that for a while now. We think it's an important project, one we can expose this reorganization in the first half of 2013 and get the profession primarily and academics to comment on that, as well as, of course, other interested bodies. But not being a rulemaking, we think we really want to hear about the usefulness of this when we put it out. The third project on here for the first half of 2013, we're going to spend more time this afternoon talking about, is the auditor's reporting model. Obviously, we've spent a lot of time talking about this matter at prior sessions of the SAG, roundtables. Of course, our concept release discussed a couple of possibilities for enhancing auditor reporting, including something that we called an auditor's discussion and analysis, required emphasis of matter paragraphs, auditor responsibilities, maybe auditing other aspects of financial information such as MD&A, as well as potentially clarifying certain aspects of the auditor's report. As you know, we've received a lot of comments back on this. At the same time, you're going to hear today about what other standard setters are doing, IAASB and others, on their projects in this regard as well. So I think everybody believes that changing the auditor's report is an important project, but changing it appropriately is equally important. And so we've obviously spent a lot of time thinking about approaches, and today we want to talk about at least a possible approach, and that would be the required use of emphasis paragraphs. But we want to hear from the SAG members in the breakout sessions about if that were the approach used, how could that work to provide all the interested parties with a reasonable amount of information that they want, while not yet making it impossible to achieve auditor reporting. Some commenters feel that certain of the other projects, such as auditor association with other documents like MD&A, there's not a demand for it, plus it would increase audit costs substantially. Sometimes we hear that the auditor's discussion and analysis, more of a free-flowing document, would need significantly more rulemaking on our part to describe how an auditor would do some of the things that are described in AD&A. The document, the board has not made a conclusion yet on how we're going to amend the auditor's report. We're still working on a variety of approaches to look at this, but this is certainly one approach that we're taking a careful look at. The IAASB, and Dan Montgomery is here from the IAASB, had a document they put out, invitation to comment, where they included something called auditor commentary, and we'll look at how that concept relates to matters of emphasis and how we could possibly look at all of these ideas and come up with something that everybody feels achieves the right balance. So we're looking for valuable input during this breakout session this afternoon about this one possible approach and how it could possibly work for all the interested parties. The next project listed on our standard setting agenda for the first half of 2013 really combines two standard setting projects that we had, where our current thinking is we're dealing with them as one item. The first was when a principal auditor or lead auditor or the group auditor uses the work of other auditors, whether they be other affiliated firms around the world or non-affiliated firms or other accountants in other parts of the world, and the interaction between the lead auditor and those other auditors, and how that lead auditor should supervise, review that work, etc. Right now in our standards, that's covered in two standards. It's the supervision standard, AS 10, as well as a standard we call Principal Auditor AU 543, where the auditor uses the reports of other auditors. We had to put out a practice alert about 18 months ago or so, because we saw that there was some confusion developing as to when auditors were giving reports, but it wasn't clear to us when we looked at it whether they thought they were operating under either AS10 or AU 543, and the practice alert clarified responsibilities in that regard. There's also, the IAASB has put out a standard on group audits, which deals with the responsibility of the lead auditor and his or her interaction with other auditors. And as I think we've mentioned in the past, in any standard setting project we do, we look at work of other auditors as well. So in doing that, we think that we can make enhancements by potentially combining and looking at 543 and AS10 and putting this under a supervision model. And at the same time, another project we had was the auditor's responsibility with respect to specialists. The specialist standard, AU 336, is a little bit of an interesting standard, again, developed many years ago, but it deals with an auditor's responsibility with respect to a company specialist as well as the auditor's own specialist, and has procedures that really about the same way, about how you deal with both of them. And we're looking at the appropriateness of that. Also, interestingly, that standard deals with a specialist that the auditor engages, a third-party specialist, whereas today, such as an engineer or a pricing evaluation expert, today many firms have specialists in-house, but specialists who are employed by an auditor, once again, they're governed by a different standard. They're governed by AS10 in terms of supervision. So specialists are in two different standards, whether you engage them or whether you employ them, even though they're doing the same type of work. So again, we're thinking about this in terms of bringing specialists together and how you supervise specialists, regardless of whether they're engaged or employed. So this is becoming, we look at this as more of a supervision responsibility in terms of how do you deal with other auditors and how do you deal with specialists and what are your responsibilities. So that's how we're working on this project and intend to propose something in the first half of 2013. The next project there deals with transparency. We issued a concept release some time ago on whether or not the engagement partner should be required to sign the audit report. That came out of a number of sources, but included a recommendation of the Treasury's Advisory Committee on the Auditing Profession. But we also had, later on, heard a number of comments back with respect to that concept release that led us to think about that application. But at the same time, we were hearing a need for more information into the transparency of not only the engagement partner, but who else is doing the audit. Many situations were coming to our attention where maybe a report was signed by a U.S. firm, but a very large percentage of the work, 80 to 90%, was being done by a firm in, let's say, China. That's not transparent to the investor if they just see the signature of a U.S. firm on the audit report with no identification of the other auditor who's participating in it. That's not the only situation, of course. There are multinational audits where a U.S. auditor might be signing the report, but maybe 60% of the work was performed by other audit firms. Could be affiliated, could be non-affiliated, but separate legal entities around the world, separately inspected by the PCAOB, or maybe in some cases in jurisdictions not inspected by the PCAOB. And so we had put out a proposal, and that proposal would indicate identification, not signature, but identification of the engagement partner, and above a certain threshold, identification of those other firms that participated in the audit. And we received a lot of comments from investors about the value of that information. We had some comments back from auditors about understanding the proposal, but in certain cases raising certain challenges they saw about those matters. For a number of reasons, we think the challenges are different, and so we have split that project into two. As you can see, the one we're dealing with in the first half of 2013 on this agenda deals with the identification of the engagement partner, and we think we've come up with a solution that should at least solve the needs of both parties, we believe. Get the information to investors and maybe deal with some of the concerns that were raised in some of the other comment letters. So we've separated that from another project you see below, I think number 9, which is identification of other firms not employed by the auditor, which had some separate issues attached to that. So they started out separately, they came together, and we expect to treat them in rulemakings separately again. But we do intend to have a rulemaking in the first half of 2013 regarding the identification of engagement partners. Major projects, a lot to get done. The staff's been working very hard on these projects throughout 2012. They were on our agenda to work on. And again, as I said, to some degree, they were delayed as we thought about the economic analysis or economic factors with respect to efficiency, competition, and capital formation for these many projects in a different way than maybe we were thinking about economic analysis before. As I said, I'm glad to answer questions during my soliloquy, so thank you, Joe, for getting me off the hook for a minute, and I'll take your question.
I figured I'd give you a break, Marty. Not really a question, just a comment that but I want to again reiterate on the audit transparency project. My recollection, and if I'm off, I'm not off much, the comment letters that you received on your original idea document, which would have required signature from investors, were almost uniformly in favor. And then the comment letters you've received on the exposure draft, which would require identification. And I think I'm right on this, is in terms of the investor comment letters are 100% in favor. So to the extent, and you haven't tipped your hand, which is appropriate, but to the extent that there's any backing away from what's in the exposure draft, I think there's certainly likely to be at least some disappointment from the investor community on that. So it's not really a question. I just wanted to get that comment out in the public forum.
Thanks for that comment. Galen?
Yes, thanks, Marty. On number 4, auditor's responsibility with respect to other accounting firms, I've raised this issue previously, and it was on the last report, and it had to do with communication between successor and predecessor auditor. We see a wide variety of cooperation when there's changes. I think it's in the interest of this group to see that cooperation. It's in the interest of investors. I hope, or I wonder whether or not that project could be expanded, or what happened to it being dropped off of the list as I see it, because certainly if we're hoping that there are changes, and especially with respect to concentration of audits within the larger firms. I just sort of wondered about that, and if you had any comments as to what happened to that.
I don't think we dropped that. No. I don't think that project was encompassed in anything we had on a prior standard setting agenda. I think we did lay out that project at the last SAG meeting as one of the potential projects we would take up, and I think I recall you endorsing us taking that up. I agree with your point clearly that if communications between predecessor auditor to the successor auditor are inadequate and are not meeting even what's required under the current standards, that's a real risk for changing auditors and for the role of the successor auditor. You've raised it before. Let us think about that one again as elevating that. Maybe let us think about that as at least at a minimum a practice alert if we think that there are things that in the existing standards auditors are not living up to, that we could communicate as to what should be done. I couldn't agree with you more, and I think most of the room would agree that that's an important communication when there's a change, to have the right communications between the predecessor and successor auditor. Maybe they should be more robust, which would be a further standard setting project, and we'll think about that as well. But at a minimum, if compliance with the existing standards isn't taking place, then we ought to do something about that. So thanks for that point. The other two projects I list here as possible with respect to the first quarter of 2013 deal with the audits of broker-dealers and going concern. Let me just comment on audit of broker-dealers, and then there was a question out there, and we'll take that right after I do that. The SEC has proposed amendments to Rule 17A5. And it's a very important rule dealing with various compliance reports and other matters that have to be filed with the SEC by brokers and dealers. And in connection with that, and in connection with the Dodd-Frank Act, which gave authority to the PCAOB for standard setting and inspections and oversight of broker-dealers as well as issuers, which we already had, the SEC, as part of 17A5, would be implementing the standard setting oversight that we were granted via the Dodd-Frank Act. So as a result of that, we've already proposed, in connection when SEC proposed amendments to Rule 17A5, we proposed amendments to certain PCAOB standards that would require, in my view, a more robust review and audit by auditors in connection with very important compliance reports that have to be filed with the SEC. Those reports being, among others, reports about broker-dealers' compliance with rules regarding the safeguarding of company assets, and we know about problems in that regard, as well as compliance with net capital rules. We've also proposed some additional requirements as part of that 17A5. We've continued to work closely with the SEC. They're moving ahead towards a finalization of Rule 17A5, and I don't know, Brian, if you want to say anything or not about that. But our goal is when the SEC adopts 17A5, we want to be in a position very shortly thereafter, immediately is a goal, but very shortly thereafter, to finalize and adopt or repropose, but depending upon the nature of the changes in the SEC rule, but potentially adopt those improvements that we think can be made to auditing in those very important areas around compliance, audits of broker-dealers, especially compliance with those very important rules.
Thanks, Marty. I wouldn't add much to that. I think Marty covered it well. Certainly, we are working very closely with the PCAOB as the staff at the SEC works to make a recommendation to the Commission in finalizing the rules under 17A5. We recognize the importance for the rules really to work together very well. And so as we proceed, we've been working very closely with the PCAOB staff, and we'll continue to do that.
So again, that potentially is a first half project, depending upon the Commission's action on 17A5. I think, John White, I think you had your card up.
This is my annual comment, but when you're doing your reorganization of the auditing standards project, which I certainly support, and I realize what I'm suggesting is not really standard setting, but I of course think that you should be also reorganizing the staff advice in a way that it is the practice alerts and the other types of staff advice, so that it's organized in a way that is more constantly updated and works. We've talked about this at length, but I think that ought to be a subset of that project.
It is an annual, or maybe I think it's a semi-annual reminder, actually, as opposed to annual. And we certainly think about that, and we think you're right. We agree with you in the importance of looking at other guidance we give and what's the relevance on an ongoing basis and how to organize it. So it is a subset of that project. We'd like to get this one done first, but we're certainly thinking of the other one as an important one as well. Before the guidance becomes too broad and it becomes a massive project, it's good to do it when it's relatively early stages about the amount of other guidance we have out there. So we agree with your point, and it's on the record a few times. The last project on our potential first half, and again, this is a project we think is very important. We think it's important to investors, and that deals with the auditor's responsibility to consider whether a company has the ability to continue as a going concern. Obviously, a lot of questions arose post-financial crisis, at least, if not otherwise, with respect to whether or not the reports were right, or if they were right, whether the going concern standard is as robust as it should be. So we've been working on a standard that would improve auditors' responsibilities to assess whether a company has the ability to continue as a going concern, and thinking about terms such as substantial doubt, what going concern means, etc. Having said that, we've also been very cognizant of the fact that FASB has considered that they would, whether FASB would put information into the accounting requirements around a company's responsibility in this area. So we've been careful not to do something that would otherwise then conflict with what FASB might do. So we're in, as the SAG has advised us a number of times, work together on this. And we have, and we've met very recently, several of our board members and staff met with a number of the board members and staff of the FASB on this subject, and with the SEC on this. So before I talk about what we might do, Larry Smith, maybe Larry, you could give a brief update as to where the FASB is on the going concern project.
Sure, Marty, thanks. As Marty indicated, we have been working, the staff of the FASB, as well as some board members and the staffs of the PCAOB and the SEC have been working together so that each of us is aware of what was going to be at least recommended to the board, to the FASB board. And last week we met, and I'll just give you a brief summary of the decisions we've made thus far and what our plans are going forward. The first decision was that management does have the responsibility to consider the likelihood of an entity's potential ability to continue or to meet its obligations as they become due in the ordinary course of business for a reasonable period of time. And we decided that management should put disclosures in their financial statements if it's more likely than not that the entity will be unable to meet its obligations in the ordinary course of business within a reasonable period of time from the balance sheet date. And those disclosures, which will be discussed in greater detail at a future meeting, will be somewhat similar to the disclosures that that auditors cause, or the auditing literature causes management to make now, discussing the circumstances and the events and circumstances that are surrounding the entity and management's plans. But again, we haven't made specific decisions on that as yet. A reasonable period of time from the balance sheet date is defined as 12 months, or if events and circumstances are probable to have occurred within 24 months, then those would be included as well. And then finally, management would have the responsibility to assert in their financial statements that there is substantial doubt about their ability to continue as a going concern when it is probable that it will not be able to meet its obligations, again, within a reasonable period of time, considering all of management's plans. So those that are ordinary in the course of business, or those that are special, to address the events and circumstances that are facing it. And that's it in a nutshell. I think in the near term, like I said, we'll be addressing the specific disclosures. We'll be addressing, comment letter deadline. We'll be discussing whether it should be applicable to private companies as well, and a comment period. And the hope is that we'll get an exposure draft out in the first quarter of next year.
Thanks, Larry. So I think that's an important update in terms of the FASB moving ahead on this with an exposure draft with disclosure thresholds at a more likely than not able to continue as a going concern. So information, if you will, earlier to investors, as well as a requirement to assert they're unable to continue as a going concern when that is probable. We are, as I said, working closely with the FASB. So as Larry said, if they come out with a exposure draft in that regard in the first quarter of 2013, we'll look to move ahead with an auditing standard geared towards that disclosure and amendments to our current auditing standard shortly thereafter. Questions, Neary Buckspan?
It's an observation and a question. I think the issue of going concern actually raises another interesting point in my mind and goes back to some of the early discussion we had about, I think, 2 years ago on this project. And I think investors yearn to information about going concern sometimes because they would like to get more information about risks and uncertainty. So if investors invest an equal dollar in a company and lost the first 99 cents while the company can continue to survive for the next 50 years, but the investors lost 90 to 95% of his or her investment, I think he will be equally disappointed or possibly more than losing the last dollar. So in this regard, I would like to tie the going concern into broad observation about risks and uncertainties and into a broader observation about auditing disclosures. And the question is, does the board has any focus on or renewed focus on auditing disclosure because of some perception that disclosures are not audited as closely as the main financial statement? Is it supported by your findings? And also put in the context of the disclosure framework project is now advocated by both the IASB and the FASB and tying it to a broader project that can be undertaken by the board. Thank you.
To your first point, certainly agree with the point, and I think part of the project is identifying what is a going concern. Doesn't necessarily mean that the company is liquidating, right, or going out of business. That's a different story. So a company could be unable to continue as a going concern, and that disclosure, more likely than not, could be at an early stage, well before it goes into bankruptcy, et cetera. So, but that's a very good point. The second one, I think we agree with you on the importance of auditing disclosures. We've made enhancements in the risk assessment standards that we issued with respect to elevating the auditor's knowledge or responsibility or awareness of the responsibilities there. Keith, I don't know if you'd like to comment any further about the risk assessment standards and the elevation I think we made there of the importance.
Well, in the risk assessment standards, we added a number of additional requirements, beginning in the early stages of the risk assessment process to require the auditor to start forming expectations about the disclosures that they would expect to see based on their understanding of the company and its environment, and going forward and considering risk that the financial statements could be specifically that they could be misstated through inaccurate, incomplete, or omitted disclosures, and then specific requirements, even the evaluation stage, about the adequacy of disclosure. So we've tried to put more specific markers, if you will, about procedures that auditors should do along the way in considering disclosures. But it is something we continue to monitor very closely what's going on with the FASB's disclosure project, and to think about other ways that we might put the right amount of audit attention on that area.
Thanks, Keith and Neary, good points. Arnie Hainish.
Thank you. With regard to the going concern proposal or issue, I guess I don't fully understand why you all feel like you need to wait for the timing of the FASB's going concern project. I mean, today, as far as issues around going concern, you've got requirements within it. I know auditors don't audit the MD&A, but clearly within the financial conditions section, within the risks and exposures areas, and even with AS16, as far as communication with audit committees, it seems like it gives the PCAOB a little bit of latitude to broaden its auditing standard around going concerns. And I think that we need to be cognizant of the redundancies that could occur. A lot of preparers have had discussions with the SEC on numerous occasions around just the redundancy that is already within the K, whether it's in the footnotes, whether it's in the MD&A, whether it's in the legal section, and it just seems like waiting until this FASB proposal, which could be based on their process, 24 to 36 months before something is finally realized. It just seems like there's an opportunity here for the PCAOB to get out in front of this from a auditing approach, communication with audit committees, and deal with a critical issue around recognition of going concern of many public entities.
Thanks, Arnie. So let me just acknowledge one comment, and that was the audit committee. So AS16, one of its many enhancements, did require the auditor to communicate to the audit committee, even in circumstances where they didn't conclude that the company had the inability to continue as a going concern. But if during their audit doubt was raised, and then management demonstrated plans to mitigate that, et cetera, there's a requirement to communicate that all with the audit committee, so the audit committee can know about that and share its views as to whether or not they agree with those plans. And so all of this is not just in management and the auditor, it's now with the audit committee also, that we thought about it and we decided not to have to disclose that going concern in our opinion, but here's why not. So we did enhance the audit committee standard in that regard. There is already obviously a standard on going concern, and if FASB was not going to act, we were working on a standard and we were ready to act. But we don't want to go out in our standard and define going concern and define what is substantial doubt, which is clearly one of the questions that was raised by many, and then have FASB come out and define it in a different way for management disclosures. We think we would just create more confusion. In general, in other meetings on this topic, Arnie, SAG members have said just the opposite. They said, we think you ought to work together. We think FASB ought to move faster on this, but we think you ought to work together. So I think more often than not, that's what we've heard. So, but thanks for the comment. Bill Platt?
Yeah, Marty, thank you. And I think I'm going to echo what you just said, is I actually think that ongoing concern, if we're dealing with transparency of the ability of an entity to continue to meet its obligations as they come due, I do think that it's a financial reporting issue as well as an audit issue. So I would actually applaud both the PCAOB and the FASB for working collaboratively on the project. And I strongly think that having the FASB go first in determining which assertions a company needs to make about its ability to continue to meet its obligations, and then address the auditing as to whether auditing those assertions or expanding upon that is the right approach. I also think that the approach that the FASB has landed on of not having a binary substantial doubt or no substantial doubt, but having early warning signs is very important to investors and to investor transparency. So I'm encouraged by the way that this project is moving, and would applaud both organizations for working collaboratively on it.
Thanks. Thank you both. We have a couple more cards up. We'll turn to them in a second. Before we do, I just wanted to indicate the projects that are below going concern there on the chart, the numbering has no particular significance. All, as I said, anything on our standard setting agenda we consider to be important, a priority. We've indicated whether we think we're going to be doing a proposal, a reproposal, a concept release, or at least in one case, next steps under consideration. But don't want you to draw any inferences whatsoever from order. It's just the ordering is important on top in the sense that the first 5 we intend to get to in the first half, and to the extent the SEC and FASB act in the first quarter, we'll probably deal with the 6 and 7 in the first half as well, or at least we'll do our best to try to. Having said that, I'm pretty much finished going over the standard setting agenda. I don't want to standing in front of the break at this point, but I do see cards up from Sam Ranzilla and Wayne Collins, and let's take those 2 cards and then let's take a break. So Sam?
Thank you, Marty. I'll be quick. On the going concern project, I, like Bill, applaud you and the FASB for taking this on collaboratively. And my only recommendation is, as you look at the FASB's timing, which I understood from Larry is first half of 2013 with a proposal, you might also consider whether the going concern project ought to be folded into the broader auditor's reporting model. Because I think your timing fits well. Because I think once you go down those two processes, you're going to find a fair amount of intersection, regardless of which way you go, with respect to enhancing the overall auditor's reporting model. And I think going concern, especially the portion if we end up in a model like FASB's, where the more likely than not triggers additional disclosure, I think that will also trigger something in the auditor's report beyond a substantial doubt paragraph. So just something for you to consider as you look at those two particular projects, because I do think you'll find intersection.
Thanks, Sam. We have given thought to that, and we will continue to. But that's certainly on the reporting end of the going concern standard. We also think that the audit procedures, and which doesn't deal as closely with the FASB aspect, is something we're working on separately that may not fit as well into the reporting project. But we agree with your comment, and generally to think about them together potentially. And then Wayne?
I'll just be real quick to echo on Bill's thought about getting away from the binary opinion and having an earlier warning, which I think a lot of investors seem to be calling for, is a good reason to wait until FASB reaches its conclusions, because to come out with a standard based on the binary approach right now from an auditing standpoint, I think would be only half a loaf in that regard. And in providing the earlier warnings, is likely to focus on some of the risks and uncertainties that was mentioned earlier in this discussion, which could provide enhanced disclosures.
Going concern has continually gotten a lot of attention at this meeting, and didn't surprise me that we had a number of cards coming up to discuss it one way or another. But generally, I'm hearing support for what you're doing, Larry, and the collaborative efforts of us and you and SEC. And Kevin, I didn't include you in the cards to be up before lunch, but since I just noticed it.
Thanks, Marty. Just a quick observation, picking up on Chairman Doty's remarks, that auditing fair value measurements and auditing management estimates appear to be a particularly biting issue, things you're finding in inspection. And with all due respect to the project formerly known as codification, I'm just scratching my head a bit about, is that the right prioritization of things that you all are seeing in practice? And I would have thought if auditing fair value measurements was a really difficult issue that you're seeing in practice that's giving rise to inspection findings, something like that would have been moved up to bucket one as opposed to being in the, maybe we'll get to that in 2013. Just an observation, Marty.
Yeah, I think it's, as I said, they're all important. One's a matter of complexity, where another one we think is a relatively quick hit. So that can help standards and help users navigate through our standards. But I couldn't agree with you more about the importance of the latter project compared to the earlier project. It's just ease of getting there and still working through some issues on the second project that we dealt with the pricing task force. We've still had conversations recently with all of the members of the pricing task force to get further updates. And we might have said something differently a year ago than we might today. As we understand it, there's much greater price transparency today at pricing services. And so therefore things are continue to evolve. And so then what we might say about some of these things might evolve as well. So it's been a little bit of a moving target from the very illiquid times when it was a real challenge and it was tough to get prices, to markets being more liquid and the pricing services being more transparent, all of those things come into play in thinking about, gee, what do we really have to do and require in this regard? So, but having said that, I nonetheless understand the relative importance of the two projects. With that, we're not going to lunch, but we are going to take a break. Lunch is not that early here on the East Coast. Let's try to be back at around 5 minutes after 11. Thanks. Okay.
All right, good morning, everyone. We're going to go ahead and get started, although I know a number of you are still getting some coffee. But I'd like to get into it so we don't take up into lunch. I know that's equally important as well. This next session, we'll be talking about the auditor's reporting model, which is a very important project for us. We will be spending over the next 2 days a significant amount of time on the auditor's reporting model project, which is, as Jim Doty mentioned, a very significant and important project of the PCAOB. This morning, I plan to provide you with brief background on the project, as well as to describe what we'll be covering in more detail this afternoon as well as tomorrow. Getting into the project, the auditor's reporting model is a subject we've been considering for a number of years. The main objective of the project is to enhance the value of the auditor's report. Many have said that the current pass-fail audit report is valuable, but it provides only limited information about the significant matters in the financial statements and the audit. Last year, we issued a concept release on possible changes to the auditor's report. The alternatives presented for changing the report included auditor's discussion and analysis, required and expanded use of emphasis paragraphs, auditor assurance on other information outside the financial statements, and clarification of the auditor's report. The board also held a roundtable to obtain further insight on the alternatives. Since then, we have been considering the feedback received and developing a proposal for public comment. Your input to us over the next couple of days will inform us greatly with respect to next steps regarding the proposal. We plan to issue the proposal in the first half of 2013, so that's coming up soon. As part of working on the project, we've also been monitoring the activities of others. Several other regulators and standard setters have been working on similar projects as the PCAOB. Our briefing paper provides some information about their approaches to auditors reporting, and I'll just highlight on that briefly. In the European Union, last year in November 2011, the European Commission introduced proposed legislation that relates to audits of public interest entities and includes specific requirements for the auditor's report. There are a number of changes included in that proposal. In September of this year, a counter-proposal was issued containing amendments to that November proposal. It was introduced at the committee level of the European Parliament. The EC's proposal is advancing through their legislative process, but as of this point, we have no indication of when that process will be finalized. The IAASB also has an active project on auditor reporting. The comment period on their most recent invitation to comment document ended about a month ago. Dan Montgomery, who's here, a couple seats from me, is an IAASB board member, but he's also the chair of the IAASB's Auditors Reporting Task Force. He is here today and will provide a brief overview of the current status of the IAASB's project, including highlights of feedback received to date. Rather than stopping and getting back into the rest, I thought I would continue talking about what we plan to cover and the objectives this afternoon, and then provide an opportunity for Dan to provide you for more information to reflect on, and then we'll open it up for questions regarding anything that we've discussed. The other regulators that we've been monitoring is the Financial Reporting Council. In September, so just a couple months ago, the UK's Financial Reporting Council concluded their consultation on the Effective Company Stewardship Project and issued revised auditing standards intended to enhance auditor reporting. Under the revised auditing standards, the auditor is required to report by exception if a required statement in the annual report issued by the board is inconsistent with knowledge acquired by the auditor. So in that instance, the auditor would be commenting if there's an inconsistency with what has been communicated by the company's board. The auditor would also report if matters discussed in the annual report by the audit committee do not appropriately address matters communicated to the auditor by the auditor to the committee. Regarding our approach and a focus of our discussions this afternoon, our approach this afternoon is focused on emphasis paragraphs, but at this point I'd like to stress that the board has not eliminated any of the alternatives described in the concept release. Based on comments received to date, though, the staff believes that there is more support for an emphasis of matters approach. Today we'll be exploring a potential approach that considers matters communicated to the audit committee as possible areas for emphasis regarding the financial statements. In August of this year, as Marty described, the board adopted Auditing Standard 16, Communications with Audit Committees. AS 16 is designed to enhance the relevance and quality of the communications between the auditor and the audit committee. It requires to communicate to the audit committee many of the same matters that investors have most frequently suggested for additional auditor reporting, such as areas of high risk to the financial statements in the audit, the most significant matters in the financial statements, such as significant management judgments and estimates, and areas with significant management uncertainty, measurement uncertainty, and quality of the company's accounting policies and practices. And finally, significant changes in or events affecting the financial statements, including unusual transactions. In the briefing paper, we provide a list of the areas that are required communications by the auditor to the audit committee. We will use that list to start our discussion this afternoon about matters that might be appropriate for the auditor to communicate in the auditor's report through emphasis paragraphs about the financial statements. I'd like to clarify that an emphasis paragraph, as currently used in the PCAOB auditing standards, is not required. It is only added solely at the auditor's discretion. The auditor may use emphasis paragraphs to emphasize a matter regarding financial statements. And several investors have commented to us in the comment letter process that emphasis paragraphs today seem infrequently used. Although we are using that same term in our project, we envision the new emphasis paragraphs could be used in a very different way. As described in the concept release, we are considering required and expanded emphasis paragraphs for the auditor's report. This means that we are considering mandated use and expanded content for the emphasis paragraphs. I'd like to briefly go over the nature of the questions for which we'll be seeking your input, and we'll be going over these in much detail this afternoon. I want to make sure we're all on the same page as far as the questions and the type of input for which we're seeking. There are 5 questions in the briefing paper. The first 3 questions relate to whether emphasis paragraphs should be required for certain matters communicated to the audit committee under AS 16. As I mentioned, AS 16 requires a number of matters to be communicated related to the audit and financial statements. Our consideration of AS 16 is that it might be a source for the auditor to consider areas for possible emphasis. Not that necessarily the communication in the emphasis paragraph would be the same as that communicated to the audit committee. Let me give you an example. One requirement under AS 16 is for the auditor to communicate disagreements with management. An emphasis paragraph might highlight the matter in the financial statements for which there was a disagreement, perhaps financial instrument valuation, but not that it was a disagreement. Any disagreement with management that the auditor has would have had to have been resolved if the auditor was able to issue an unqualified report. Therefore, the disagreement would have gone away. But the auditor may feel it's appropriate to highlight the matter that caused significant discussion with the audit committee. We're seeking your input on whether AS 16 would be an appropriate source for considering matters of emphasis. If so, should any of those matters in AS 16 be required to be reported, so just mandated to be included in emphasis paragraphs? Or should the auditor have discretion for some or all of them as far as which items to highlight in the emphasis report? If certain things were left, should be permitted to be left to the auditor's discretion, Should there be any factors that the auditor should consider in determining which matters are most important to the financial statement users? For instance, factors could include subjectivity, the level of subjectivity, measurement uncertainty, degree of interaction with the audit committee, or something else. Could be some of the above that the auditor would consider, or none of the above. So we're interested in your input on that. And finally, regarding emphasis paragraphs, we're interested in what's the appropriate level of detail that should be provided in the emphasis paragraph. What information is important to be included and why? For instance, should it describe the area and provide reference to the information in the notes to the financial statements, or provide other information? If so, what information would be appropriate? Moving on to question 4. Question 4 asks whether there should be any special reporting considerations for audits of smaller and less complex companies, brokers and dealers, and emerging growth companies. As you are aware, the PCAOB writes standards for audits of issuers, including emerging growth companies, as well as for audits of brokers and dealers. We are interested in your input on whether a standard requiring emphasis paragraph should have special considerations for certain types of entities. Finally, we're interested in whether there are specific elements of the projects of other regulators or standard setters, such as the activities of those of the IAASB, that the PCAOB should consider for its auditor's reporting model project. When we get together this afternoon, we will have breakout group discussions on these questions, which are included in your paper, and we're very much looking forward to your input. We will have 4 breakout sessions this afternoon, so this group will be divided into a 4th. Each one of you should have in your folder a note indicating which session you will be joining. And each breakout session will be led by PCAOB staff, and as I said, will include approximately a quarter of the group. Tomorrow morning, the PCAOB staff that are at the breakout session will present a summary of each one of the breakout sessions, so even though you weren't in the other 3, you will certainly hear what happened in those other groups. But when that summary is presented for the group in which you're participating, you will have an opportunity to add any commentary that perhaps may have been left out, or to emphasize any particular area, and then also have an opportunity to comment on themes, issues that came up in the other groups. So we are very much looking forward to a robust discussion tomorrow as well. With that overview of what we hope to accomplish, I will turn it over to Dan Montgomery so that he can provide you with further information about the IAASB's activities. And then after Dan is finished, we'll open it up for any discussions about anything that we plan to continue, or the PCAOB's projects, or if you have any questions for Dan. So with that, Dan, I'll turn it over to you.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Jennifer, and good morning, everyone. It's indeed my pleasure to be here and appreciate the opportunity to update you on the IAASB's auditor reporting project in my capacity as IAASB Deputy Chair, as well as Jennifer said, as the Chair of the Auditor Reporting Task Force. Professor Arnold Schilder, the chair of the IAASB, ordinarily would be here. He had a previous commitment this week, is attending the IFAC Council meeting in South Africa, so was unable to be here, but it expresses his best wishes to all of you. I'd like to give you a very brief overview and current status of the auditor reporting project. And Jessica, if you could go to the next slide. Focusing in particular on the IAASB's most recent consultation document. It was an invitation to comment that was issued in June of this year. It was the second consultation for the IAASB. There was a previous consultation paper issued in May of 2011. And that first consultation focused on obtaining views and input about some of the concerns that had been raised about auditor reporting, as well as some very broad suggestions for types of changes that could be made. The invitation to comment was much more focused on specific types of improvements to the auditor's report. So the ITC, as indicated here, sets out the indicative direction for a future auditor's report, and it really represents an amalgam, if you will, of many different suggestions for possible improvements that were received from global stakeholders, as well as presents the IAASB's views on relative value and impediments, including costs. The ITC served as a basis for 3 public roundtables. You see them there. Several of you either attended or in fact participated in our roundtable in New York, and in fact, in Paul's case, in Kuala Lumpur. And we appreciate that input. The IAASB has to date received 164 responses. That number is relevant to us, to the IAASB, because it really is about 3 to 4 times the number of comment letters that we normally would receive on a project, and it is double the number, exactly double the number of comment letters that were received on the original consultation paper. I might add that the IAASB continues to monitor and be informed by the efforts of the PCAOB, the European Commission, and others as well. So on the next slide, what have we heard so far through these public roundtables and in the very preliminary analysis of the comment letters? And I might add here that these points are representative of a very early analysis. IAASB staff is continuing to go through and digest the comment letters. But overall, I can tell you that there's broad support for change in the auditor's report, broad support for making the auditor's report more informative. With respect to the specific suggested improvements in the ITC, broad support across stakeholder groups for various of these suggested changes, but not all of them. But clearly some divergent views in terms of how best to proceed. And these divergent views are in some cases very strongly held, and the challenge for the IAASB will be to reconcile these divergent views. Some of the very overarching comments that came through that the IAASB will need to consider, one that came through very clearly from all stakeholder groups was to preserve the separation of responsibility between management, those charged with governance, and the auditor. So make sure the auditor is not providing original information about the entity or the financial statements. The second one is reflect back on Marty's earlier comment, which is change is important, but changing things appropriately also is important. So identify changes that indeed will move the ball forward, will be viewed as serving the public interest, but with a thorough consideration of the relative benefits and impediments. From an international perspective, making sure that there's flexibility to incorporate different types of reporting regimes in different jurisdictions. And then finally, an acknowledgement that changing the auditor's report alone is probably not the whole answer here, that there may be changes needed also in financial reporting, in governance, and also in education. So consider all of these elements as well. Next slide, please, Jessica. In terms of this suggested improvement on auditor commentary, and the invitation to comment described it as a new separate section of the auditor's report that would provide information that was based on the auditor's judgment relating to matters that the auditor deemed to be of most importance to users' understanding of the financial statements or the audit. And in that regard, mixed views on that particular objective. There was support for some kind of commentary, if you will, support for the auditor to provide certain additional information, but certain mixed views on the best way to do that. I would say in this regard, there were probably 4 things that came up. One acknowledging that there already is a mechanism, emphasis of matter, that could be used, perhaps could be clarified and used more frequently. That was point number one. Secondly, some said if you have a concept of auditor commentary or expanded emphasis of matter, that it should be more than just a reference to management's disclosures. That's the reference to additional audit context here. So some said at least provide an indication of why the auditor believed this matter was important. A third point of view here was support for this type of an approach, commentary of some kind, but perhaps also retaining the current concept of emphasis of matter. Those holding that view said there's a certain value attached to those matters of emphasis today, so perhaps keep that and have another category that highlights additional important matters. And then finally, there were some that said the auditor shouldn't be providing any information about the financial statements, that the auditor should be providing more information about the audit, how the audit was conducted. So just some preliminary views on the letters. Clearly, a need for robust guidance, criteria to help inform the auditor's judgment in this regard. Concerns expressed about having the right language here to indicate that this is information in the context of the audit of the financial statements as a whole, to avoid any concerns about piecemeal opinions, hidden qualifications, or separate assurance. And then lastly, the very strong support in terms of applicability for applying this notion to listed entities. And in that regard, I might say there were also some that said even for listed entities, perhaps a consideration of how the concept might be scalable or applied proportionately to smaller listed entities. On the next slide, certain of the other suggested improvements in the ITC, going concern was a key aspect because there were some very strong calls globally for the auditor to include explicit statements in the auditor's report about going concern. But in this regard, the letters have indicated support for that, but also an acknowledgement of the importance of this area, and therefore also support for enhanced reporting, enhanced disclosures by management, with perhaps then the auditor making some reference to those disclosures. Also some concerns about lack of understanding, common understanding of terminology, and encouraging the IAASB to work collaboratively with the IASB in having a look at guidance for both preparers and for auditors. Across the board, support for some kind of a statement in the auditor's report relating to the auditor's responsibility for other information that is included with the audited financial statements, including identifying the information read and the auditor's conclusion, if you will, on that. And just yesterday, the IAASB released an exposure draft on an updated standard that includes some reporting language in that regard. Other auditors, basically the involvement of other auditors, much concern expressed about that, specifically pointing to running counter to the sole responsibility principle in the International Auditing Standard on group audits. And finally, then on naming the audit partner, basically there's support in many jurisdictions because it's already done today, but on balance, I think the message was maybe something that's best left for national standard setters to decide. And then finally, the last slide here, just quickly to point to timing, and that is the IAASB. This is the #1 priority project. It's on a very accelerated timetable, and the goal still is to have an exposure draft of a revised auditor reporting standard by next June, with final standards a year after that. So with that, I will stop, and Jennifer, turn it back to you.
Thank you very much, Dan. That was quite informative. So now I'd like to open it up to see if there's any questions on anything that I covered regarding the objectives of our discussions over the next 2 days, anything about the project itself on the PCAOB's end, as well as any questions for Dan. So I see Bob Hers.
Yeah, it's a question for Dan. Kind of given what our charge this afternoon is, in the context of your proposal and thinking, is there any linking to any existing or potential international standard on communications between the auditor and the audit committee, or a similar corporate governance oversight mechanism?
I would say in that case, clearly yes. Where it has come up is in the criteria for determining the matters to include in auditor commentary and aligning that as best as possible with matters that had been discussed to a significant degree with audit committees. So not dissimilar to I think what has been outlined in the PCAOB paper here.
Okay, Jeff Mahoney.
Thank you. I actually had the same question. If I look at paragraphs 43 to 47 of your document, Dan, would you view that as similar to what's in the PCAOB paper of their proposed approach? And second, you mentioned this term, original information was on your slide. And I'm just curious about the definition of that. Would that include the auditor's report on the financial statements? Would that be viewed as original information under that definition? Thank you.
Well, let me take the second one first, because there has been considerable discussion, I will say, at the task force level and the IAASB about what is meant by original information. And it's in the context of whatever words the auditor uses in the auditor's report, not conflicting with what management has disclosed in the financial statements. So if it's related to the financial statements or the entity, if there's language there that is new information, it could be perceived as the auditor stepping over the boundary, providing original information about the entity, and or confusing readers of the financial statements in the auditor's report about the information that management has presented. Having said that, there are still some questions about, well, if the auditor would summarize some of the information in a note disclosure and include that in a section on auditor commentary or an emphasis of matter paragraph, does that represent original information? So there's still more discussion that needs to happen, at least at the IAASB level, about the nature and content of these paragraphs and how that relates to this concept of original information. With respect to your other point on paragraphs 43 through 47 of the ITC, I will say this. I think there are some definite parallels between what is being considered here and what the PCAOB has outlined and will be discussed in more detail. But the global stakeholders of the IAASB, I think, had indicated a desire for perhaps more information, more and different information. So while there are some parallels, there also, at least in the ITC, there were some differences that need to be reconciled going forward. We might ask Marty or Jennifer to comment on how their proposals might, or an outlined approach might align with what is here.
We'll look forward to the input this afternoon in that regard.
Okay, I see Roman Wheel.
Some of you can anticipate what I'm going to talk about. I'm talking about the financial literacy of the audit committee. Pregnant by its absence in this, I've searched through the whole document. is any addressing of the issue that the auditor is supposed to comment, investigate the suitability of the members of the audit committee to be on that. This goes back to your release 2004-001. Maybe that's been repealed. I can't figure that out. But there's nothing in this that talks about the tension that arises because the auditor is supposed to evaluate the effectiveness of the audit committee to do its job, and that the audit committee decides who gets hired and ultimately what they get paid. This is a big problem, I think, and nowhere in these documents do I see this issue discussed. In my presentations, which are 3 or 4 times a year, and I have audit committees in the audience, I always start with a quiz just to get people's minds engaged and see where they are. And my current quiz is, how many of you have ever heard of OCI? This is audit committee members. Typically, 25% of the hands will go up. Only 25%. How many of you have ever used OCI to make a single decision of any kind? There may be 1 or 2 hands that go up, usually 0. To use a technical term in Alabama, where I'm from, I'm believing that audit committee members generally don't know diddly squat about accounting. They don't know enough to be financially literate. The chairman of the audit committee, I think, is there. Over the last 7 years since Sarbanes-Oxley, we've gotten at least 1 financially literate person on the board. But my experience is that 1 out of 3, 2 out of 3 of the members shouldn't be there. And it's the auditor's job to tell the nominating committee this is true, but they won't do it if they were dependent on these same people for retention and pay. It's a tension that I don't see addressed. I will certainly bring it up in the group that I have, but I'd like all of you groups to think about whether the non-addressing of this issue is important. That's a statement to my fellow SAG members, not really a question for you, but maybe you have a response.
Well, I do. Well, I have some observations. I don't know if it helps you or not, but our standards do require through either through auditing standard number 5, audit of internal control over financial reporting, or even if an auditor is doing an audit of financial statements only, to consider the tone at the top, the control environment of the company under audit, which includes, and certainly in my view, and I believe it's also included in the standards, and Keith worked on the risk assessment standards, the audit committee. So if the auditor had a concern with the audit committee, certainly that should affect their audit strategy, the work that they're going to perform, reliance on the control environment, that they may need to increase the amount of work. And we've addressed this issue, I know at least in the release, and Jessica, looking at Jessica, but we talked about areas within auditing standard 16 that could be communicated to the audit committee, the auditor's concerns about it. So in my view, if it's an area of significance, it could be a possible, considering those matters that were communicated to the auditor, a possible area for communication, although it's not directly stated because it's part of the company's control environment. So I don't know, Jessica or Keith, if you want to add anything, or I'm getting nods, so. I wanted to point that out as far as, I hopefully that helps you, but I don't think our standards are silent just because it doesn't mention it. All right, let me move on. I know we have a few more cards. I have Rick Murray. I'll take Rick since you're at that table.
Thank you very much, Jennifer. Quick follow-up on Jeff's question to help us understand this afternoon's discussion and how we can contribute. It may be an obvious one, I don't know, to you or Dan. Has there been any work done thus far that reconciles the IASB's original information position, or at least as that has emerged in your work, with the emphasis of matter suggestion that we're to consider? And given that there isn't anything that couldn't be gathered by management and reported out in management's disclosures that might otherwise come from an emphasis of matter issued by the auditor, has that dichotomy between putting the emphasis in the auditor's words as contrasted with those who think original information should not arise from the auditor. Has that issue been reconciled, or is that part of what we will be addressing today?
I think that's what we're addressing today. I think that both our project and the IAASB's project, at least insofar as we're thinking of either commentary or matters of emphasis, are starting with the financial statements and what should be brought out. But the question then goes to, okay, how far should it be brought out? And what should the auditor be saying about it? How much detail about the matter? Additional information that's not in the financial statements about financial information. Many have said that's original information that should come from management. So how to bring out additional information, how to make these paragraphs valuable and not just a roadmap, I think is what was said by Dan, and I think we've heard similar things too. So that's really a subject for this afternoon's breakout sessions with that point about how to make these kind of paragraphs, if this is a solution, make them valuable.
Well, I have a number of cards up, which is very encouraging as far as our discussions this afternoon. I expect it to be quite robust. And we also want to cover fraud. I'm just going to turn to Marty real quick as far as timing. To my count, I have 6 cards up, and then the fraud discussion. So
yeah, let's try to take the cards that are up and then move to the next topic. But I think what we're finding here is many of these questions are the questions we want to address this afternoon in the breakout sessions. And so if it's a matter you think we're going to discuss in the breakout session, you think we can leave it till then, and remember we're coming back again tomorrow to talk about it again, maybe you don't need to have that point addressed now. But if it's spot on to something that Dan said and you want to just get clarification, maybe that's better. Okay.
Okay, Kurt Schott, your cards went down, so you're down. Okay. I had Bob Guido. I don't see Bob right now. Is he still up? Oh, okay, right in front of me.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much. And I would encourage as much convergence as possible. Again, representing the audit committee community, I would like to see that. But I really put my card up because I wanted to address Roman's question. Okay. As an audit committee chair, I really don't want 4 other financial experts on my audit committee. And the reason I don't, and let me tell you that we work hard in educating all of our audit committee members on current topics and high-risk issues, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a lot going on. There's a lot that's happened since Sarbanes-Oxley out there, and I would not underestimate the power of the audit committee in their knowledge. I would add that I believe, personally, that's me speaking, that divergence of views on audit committees are very important. I find some of the best questions of my fellow audit committee members are those who are not financial experts. And I really wouldn't want to stifle that at all. So I just wanted to make that observation.
Thanks, Bob. Next is Harrison Green.
Hi, I have a question for Dan. And I was, if you could help me understand when you had on your slide a thing about the sole responsibility, where there's a preclusion in the IAASB standards about naming other auditors. And I know in the U.S. we can split that responsibility within the opinion. And I guess my question is, how does naming other audit firms that participated in the audit violate the IAASB's principle of the sole responsibility?
In that regard, the views that were expressed by many commenters related to the fact that the standard explicitly indicates that the group auditor has sole responsibility for the opinion, and that any reference to other auditors might confuse that sole responsibility and raise questions about which auditor, in fact, was taking responsibility for the group audit opinion. That's why respondents are pointing to that sole responsibility principle, because there is no vehicle under the international standards for a group auditor to divide responsibility.
Thank you, Dan. I'd just like to point out Dan's project in auditor reporting covers disclosure, naming of the engagement partner and other firms. And I think you're aware, but just to point out that that's a separate project for us. We had issued a proposal last year, and Marty talked about the timing of it for 2013 regarding the engagement partner and other firms. So we won't plan on covering that aspect this afternoon, but both of those areas are active projects for us.
And I think I'd only add that I think we heard a lot of demand and support for naming of other auditors, and I think that, at least as we understood it, that there was still clarification that the view that people understood that there was a signing auditor that had principal responsibility, and that they were assuming responsibility for the work of those other auditors, but there's still valuable informational content in knowing who else participated in that audit, especially in situations where you had another auditor who did maybe 80% of the work in an emerging market. So in any event, it's a subject that we're thinking about still, and I know the IAASB is still thinking about it.
Okay, I have 2 cards left. So Steve Buller, you're next.
Yeah, just 2 things. First of all, from Roman's comment, I don't remember if it was in the European Parliament proposed regulations regarding the statutory audits of PIEs, but I think there it may have actually suggested that you have a requirement to have one person who's a financial expert and one person with auditing expertise specifically. So I'm very sensitive to Bob's comment, but they at least suggested that they need not all be auditors, but at least they have that balance on the committee. A question for Dan Rudy. I was surprised by your comment, Dan, on the people who asked for information on how the audit was conducted, because when I looked through the invitation to comment on the improving the auditor's report by the IAASB, it didn't really focus on that issue. And I'd be curious as to whether the tenor of those comments was more about the specific procedures performed or the criteria that they used in performing those, such as materiality, or if it was information being requested on the evaluation process and conclusions that were used in determining how the audit was performed.
Steve, there was no clear indication of the type of information that some would be looking for with respect to the audit. I mentioned it came up in 2 or 3 different contexts. One was if the auditor is commenting on matters disclosed in the financial statements, that it would be useful to have at least some audit context to that in terms of, at a minimum, why the auditor believed that matter was important to the audit. And then also some that just say it's not the auditor's responsibility to provide information about the financial statements. That's management's responsibility. I would say that's a smaller number of respondents, and it seemed to be more focused, European focused, I might add, in terms of those that said the auditor should provide more information about how the audit was conducted. So hopefully that responds.
Okay, Galen Hansen, you have the last word on this subject.
Thanks, Dan, for doing this. I was at your New York roundtable, and thank you for that invitation. I do have a question on auditor commentary, and it seems that in New York, a lot of the discussion about auditor commentary was how do we know what is likely to be important to users' understandings of financial statements? And so my question is sort of a benchmarking question. Certainly that 164 letters and the surveys that have been done already, but from a benchmarking standpoint, are we talking about a sole investor, or are we talking about a sophisticated investor? Is there an intermediary step here? Is more academic research required on that particular point before you're able to go forward and be comfortable about what investor are we talking about here on auditor commentary?
I think, Galen, I would just say at this point that there's more discussion that needs to take place. There were several respondents to the ITC that pointed to that particular issue. How does the auditor determine what is in fact most important to a user? Because you could have different users having different needs, different views of what's important to them. So I think there will be more discussion needed about the objective of this particular section and the types of matters that might be highlighted. And I believe that the discussion that we'll have this afternoon could be highly informative in that regard in terms of the types of the criteria to help identify matters to then help frame an objective for this particular section or the use of these paragraphs.
Galen, I'd just like to add, in our staff thinking at least regarding the PCAOB project as far as investors goes to the reasonable investor concept, which already exists in terms of the audit. The auditors, when they look at materiality and overall disclosures, that goes to the reasonable investor. So we're looking to that test, and there's case law, et cetera, that kind of routes that concept in the United States. So that's our perspective, or staff thinking at this point. Before I turn it over to Keith, I just wanted to just briefly point out, because I failed to mention at the start, Jessica Watts, who's also listed on the slide, is a key member of the team. You will be seeing her tomorrow in particular. She'll be summarizing feedback from what we hear from all of the groups collectively. You will also hear from another number of team members that are also from the PCAOB on the auditor's report. You'll be meeting them this afternoon, and they'll be talking. Some of them will be talking tomorrow. So anyway, so you'll be hearing more from us, and we look forward to hearing from you. So with that, I turn it over to Keith to talk about fraud.
Thanks, Jennifer. As Marty mentioned earlier, last May, the SAG talked about potential additional topics for future SAG discussion or future standard setting projects. And one of those was a task force of the SAG on the auditor's approach to detecting financial statement fraud. And there were a number of SAG members who thought that was a good idea to pursue a task force idea. We did get some good advice, though, that if we were going to go down that road, that we should have the task force should be properly focused. We should have clear objectives for them, and not just be a task force for the sake of another task force on fraud. We thought that was good advice, and one of the things we want to do today in our second set of breakout sessions, which will follow the same format that Jennifer outlined, is to try and brainstorm a little bit and get your views and advice on how we should approach this. We have a briefing paper that we had, which is intended to be a thought piece, a catalyst for discussion, if you will, about how to approach the subject. Some of the things that we're really especially looking for, we stepped back and took a little bit broader perspective on the issue and said, well, let's think about, is the task force the right vehicle? Is there some other kind of outreach? So we're interested in your views on different vehicles that we might use. What's the right kind of vehicle to use? We're also really interested in your advice on particular who we should outreach to. And certainly the members of the SAG represent a lot of key stakeholder groups: investors, audit committees, preparers, internal auditors, independent auditors, all who have a particular interest in preventing and detecting financial statement fraud. We certainly want your view, those kind of views. They're very important to us. But we're also interested in your advice on, are there other organizations, other types of groups, other particular people that we should be doing outreach to. For example, one of the things we heard last May was there have been some short sellers that have been particularly good at spotting some of the recent fraud. So should we be talking to them and understanding how they've gone about doing that, and something we can learn from them? Then, very importantly, we want your views on things that we should focus on in the outreach. We've, in the paper, laid out 3 different broad areas. They're not intended to in any way limit discussion, but we're interested in, for example, things that we could do to improve our existing requirements to make them more effective, potentially. Are there other procedures that should be required for all audits, or for particular audits or particular situations that we should be considering based on things that we learn from other professions or other professionals? And another category of the things that might be done to enhance quality control systems in firms, for example, to enhance the application of professional skepticism in audits. So your ideas there are very welcome. We're really interested in what you might have to say and your thoughts and advice on how to focus that discussion. One thing I do want to point out that's a critical point for us is today's session we want to really focus on the auditor's approach to detecting financial statement fraud. So by that, I mean for situations for intentional misstatement of the financial statements, cooking the books, if you will, for example, to make a company look healthier or more profitable than it is, or to cover up situations where someone's stealing from the company. Certainly, there are many other things that unsavory business practices, illegal acts that companies can get into and audit. Sometimes their questions arise about what auditors should be doing in that area. And if you have strong thoughts on that, please share them. But at this point, for today's purpose, we want to really focus on financial statement fraud. So that's the objective, to try and get better understanding of how we should approach outreach, what we should be focused on, who we should be talking to, and those sort of things. As I said, we'll be following the same basic approach that Jennifer described, and Brian DeGano to my right is going to be leading the discussion, the summary of the key takeaways tomorrow. So with that, I'm going to welcome comments and questions that you might have on the topic. Denny Beresford.
Thanks. I was surprised that there was no reference to the Treasury study of the auditing profession, reference to the possible creation of a national center to facilitate auditing firms and other market participants sharing of fraud prevention and so forth under the PCAOB. This is a task force, obviously, but there could just as well be a fraud center. I know this has been something that's been discussed off and on by SAG and other groups over the years, but it seems like it just sort of disappeared from the scene. Could you tell us what the story is there?
I'll take that one. This meeting this afternoon and this discussion topic that we're dealing with today is just a separate issue. We're dealing with, in particular, with the auditor's responsibility with respect to detecting fraud, as Keith clearly laid out, and other outreach that we might do, or SAG task force to consider whether the existing responsibilities in AU 316 and our risk assessment standards, et cetera, are appropriate. Other ideas that have come up over time about forensic auditing or improvements to firms' quality controls or improved professional skepticism, and all things like that are on the table for discussion about how to improve detection of fraud and the auditor's responsibilities. So this is directed directly to the audit. A fraud center is kind of a different concept, whether we have one or not, and I think that's just not today's topic. So maybe that's about all I can say on that, Denny. Barbara?
Just on that topic, which is not our topic, I'd like to
reinforce Denny's point. I actually think a fraud center is fundamental to this issue of how the board continues to conduct research and outreach and considers development of responses, or ought to be. So I would just like to second that comment.
Jim?
It's still on our agenda. It's part of our strategic plan. It's part of our budget deliberations, discussions with the SEC. This is seen by some of us as being functionally related to getting to a good sense on how we can have a fraud center, where it can be located, how it's staffed, and how it functions with respect to the other programmatic parts of the PCAOB. It has not been ignored, and it certainly hasn't been rejected as something we should be thinking about doing. There has been a lot of thought and discussion at the board about what it should be and how it should be integrated with the operations of the PCAOB and its standard setting, enforcement, and inspection efforts.
Roman Will.
I'm talking here as an academic, a theorist, not a theoretician. My background's in economics. Economics studies trade-offs. Every person in this room knows there's a trade-off between fraud audits and cost. I have searched this document using a PDF search function, and I cannot find a single instance of the word cost in this 16-page document, nor of the word expense. From that, I infer we are being silent on the trade-off, the inevitable trade-off between the more fraud audit we do, the more costly it's going to be, and I don't see how you can do that. Somebody's got to address what it makes sense to spend the cash for. And if we require more fraud for everybody, the cost of everybody's audit is going to go up. Is that cost effective? Where is the discussion of cost? Did I overlook it?
Good point. I'm glad you brought that up. It's obviously implicit in any standard setting project we do. I think this morning I spent a bit of time talking about how even before the Jobs Act, we've engaged upon thinking about how to further enhance our thinking about economic analysis into all of our rulemakings. So that we do. If we went ahead with any rulemaking, we'd have to consider economic analysis, the benefits of this project, its costs, as well as considering if we had any changes in our standards, whether or not that would promote efficiency, competition, and capital formation, and the impact on emerging growth companies. So all of those things ultimately would have to come into play, and certainly to the extent we talk about ideas this afternoon and outreach, if people have thoughts about, sounds like a great idea, sounds extraordinarily expensive, love to hear comments on that. So that's a good point, Roman. Thanks.
The one thing I would add to that is I think one of the things we would hope is, as part of this outreach, to get different stakeholders around the table. That's naturally part of the conversation is evaluating trade-offs and what's the right combination if there are enhancements to be made, if there were additional forensic component to the audit, what would be the right way to shape that? What would be the cost trade-offs, and what would one do? So that is certainly part of what's envisioned in the process, although you rightly point out we don't use the word cost or expense in the discussion. Mike Cook?
I think I recall, raising a question when we talked about this in May. I know I had it written down, and I think I expressed it at that time, which is what information, what research, what analysis has been done to give you and give us, as we try to react to and give input, on how serious is the problem today? Is it getting a lot worse? Are there lots of financial statement frauds that are going undetected, and if so, why, and what's the nature of those? And this is a little bit of the question Roman is asking, I guess I'm challenging maybe the benefit side, because I know the cost is going to be considerable. And I think most of us would agree that 99-point-something% of all the corporations in America have never engaged in financial statement fraud, never will, but they will all pay whatever cost is imposed through the system, whether it's auditor effort or any other element. 99% of the people will pay the cost to prevent the 1% who maybe are going to do what they're going to do regardless of any preventative measures. But my question is, why don't we have before us some, I don't know what advice to give about how you ought to go about this, because if this is a burning platform and financial statement fraud is happening all over the place at an increasing rate, that would demand one type of a response. I'm not aware of that. All I do is read the papers these days, so I don't have any statistical information of any kind available to me, but it seems to me that this, unless you wander off as some people do and confuse the mortgage crisis and the financial crisis with fraud, that was all about incompetence. That wasn't about fraud. In most instances, there may have been a few bad actors in the play who were intentionally bad actors as opposed to just not being good actors. But my question here is, what is the magnitude of this problem? And given that PCAOB doesn't have unlimited resources, and we can't just continue to just impose costs on people to try, I realize financial statement fraud is horrible, and we got to do everything we can to stomp it out, but we can't impose a ridiculous amount of cost in the financial reporting system and the capital markets to try to catch the 0.5% bad guys who we probably aren't going to catch anyway. Our experience usually tells us we don't catch them. But my question is, where is the empirical evidence, there must be some, about how serious this problem is, and is it getting worse? Is it getting better? And if it's getting better, why are we going to go do so much instead of doing some other things? And if it's getting worse, we really need to think of a different kind of approach. So I'm just puzzled. I asked the question 6 months ago and don't have an answer today. What is the magnitude of the problem in comparison to what it has been historically?
That you're raising an excellent point, and that is an area of research that we've targeted and identified. It's one of those things where we're certainly in continuing to look at, and perhaps we can have some additional discussion on that this afternoon.
Keith, my only suggestion would be maybe you should try to finish that research before you ask us what it is that ought to be done, because the results of that research would be a very good indicator of how you ought to go about this and what degree of urgency and how much cost to put behind it. But not having the results of the research, this is an interesting hypothetical question.
Joe Carcello, I think you want to respond to that.
Let me respond to Mike, please. Mike, if you would Google COSO, which you're familiar with, I was involved with 3 other people in a study that COSO funded, where we looked at all instances of fraudulent financial reporting, the type that Marty is interested in learning about today, from 1998 to 2007. And so I'll just give you a little bit, not a whole lot. You can read the whole monograph on your own if you want. Our search identified 347 companies involved in alleged instances of fraudulent financial reporting during the 10-year period. These 347 alleged fraud instances are described in 1,335 individual accounting and auditing enforcement releases. So these are fraud-related actions brought by the Securities and Exchange Commission over that 10-year period. If you 347 divided by 10, that's about 35 per year. So you can be the judge as to whether or not you think that's problematic or not. In terms of consequences there, Mike, the average fraud company stock price dropped an average by an abnormal 16.7% in the 2 days surrounding the initial press disclosure of the alleged fraud. Fraud company stock prices also abnormally declined an average of 7.3% in the 2 days surrounding the announcement of a fraud investigation by the SEC or the Department of Justice. And then we have other consequences, much higher level of bankruptcy, much higher level of delisting, consequences to the perpetrators, obviously. So this is not the be-all and end-all because we're relying on public data, and there's a lot of data we wish we had that's private, but it at least responds a little bit to what you're asking for.
If I could just add just a real quick footnote to it. One, I appreciate the information. It would have been very helpful to have had that information before we came here to make some judgments about what the magnitude of the problem is, and we might have differences of opinion as to how serious it is. I'm not sure if the number 15,000 public companies is correct. I'm not sure how much cost I would impose on 14,965 of them to catch the 35, if you think you could even catch the 35. If I understood, Jim, what you were saying about how many per year, because we're going to impose cost on 15,000 companies.
There's nothing in this project that imposes cost on anybody. The PCAOB is asking, should we set up a task force to look at these issues? The questions you're asking would seem to be part of the research that would be conducted through that task force. There's nothing in this that's saying the result of that is going to be this hugely expanded fraud standard. You're going to try and get the facts that would allow for an intelligent discussion. How is that a cost concern?
I think that would have been about my summary as well. So you said it
Perhaps
better.
in a calmer tone of voice.
But it would have been a similar comment that we're not proposing anything right now. We're considering whether or not to do research. So that's what this is about. It says consideration of outreach or research regarding this. So this is at early stages. And I do think, by and large, at the last SAG meeting, you did make a comment. I think, by and large, the SAG said, yeah, this is an important area, so go ahead and do some more research. We just wanted to dig in even deeper to find out what type of research and get further input on that. So I think thanks all for the comment. I think maybe there's one more card up. Dan, did you? Well, we have we do need to break, and a lot of these topics are really things we could be covering in the breakout session again this afternoon, and we'll be reporting back tomorrow on the comments we heard. So we have the breakouts. We have Dan is up. Lynn is on the phone, and Bill Platt. Then we're going to break it there. Thanks.
So my question actually sort of relates to Mike's comment and to a comment that Joe made in response to that. I was wondering if the decision would ultimately be to set up a task force. It seems to me that the PCAOB sits on a lot of non-public information that Joe referenced through the inspection process, maybe other processes too. Has there been any thought to a way in which complying with the legal constraints that the PCAOB faces, that the task force could access or make use of that to sort of see what empirical data might exist? There is obviously the public work that's been done that's been referenced, but I'm thinking there might be a treasure trove of data that could be helpful if the decision is to create a task force.
Thanks. That's something certainly that we always consider what we're seeing in our own activities and oversight, inspections, et cetera. So yeah, it's a point well taken. Okay, Lynn Turner.
What they were doing with their numbers. And the most recent study said that 18% of CFOs have manipulated their numbers by something like 10%, a very material number, and that's almost 1 out of 5 that number is up. I think the number was something like 13 to 15% in 1998. So we do have some concrete evidence that something is amiss. It's available publicly, and that things perhaps even have gotten worse in that respect in recent years rather than better. So, Mike, I have sent you a copy of that research study, and hopefully you'll find it useful, but it does provide evidence that investors are getting some very bad data on a fairly widespread basis. That's almost 1 out of 5 CFOs surveyed admitting that. What you got to worry about is the ones who are doing it but weren't willing to admit to do it, and it would be of greater concern if we actually knew what that actual number was as well. Thank you.
Okay, Bill Platt, you get the last word.
Thanks. And these are follow-up comments really to a number of comments that were made. But I guess as I think about the area of fraud, and I think about the request for us to think solely about what the auditor can do about fraud and detecting it, it seems to me that if we're saying what's the objective or what's the problem we're trying to solve, and if the problem we're trying to solve is to decrease the rate of financial reporting fraud, I think the last approach would be to focus solely on the auditor. If you think about it, there's the whole environment. There's environmental factors. There's tone at the top in the organization. There's corporate ethics. There's all kinds of other programs that can help reduce the incidence of financial reporting fraud. I also think that by focusing on the 35, Joe, in your example, a year, situations that got to a point of being so severe that they become a major restatement and an enforcement investigation, is really only looking at a subset of what the environment is. And I do think that each and every day, when you look at frauds, history would tell you most frauds didn't start as a big thing. They started small. And I could tell you as an auditor, my teams are out there every day of the week finding small stuff and fixing it. And that small stuff being fixed stops it from growing and stops it from being the next fraud that's out there. And you'll never have a way to capture that. You'll never have a way to tell, what's the influence that having the auditor present and finding the small stuff day in and day out does before it becomes fraudulent activity. It's just a step in the direction that, if not caught, becomes fraud. But I would encourage the PCAOB to not put its blinders on to just say, what can the auditors do to find the big fraud, but think more holistically about fraud, the environment that's conducive to fraud, and what are things that can be done to give better corporate ethics and better corporate culture. I also, one of the points you made is that I think, and I forget what words you used, but other business practices that might be unethical or things like that. And I often struggle with this concept about, if I have an organization that's willing to lie to its customers and cheat its employees, but we get to financial reporting and, oh, by God, they're going to be perfectly ethical and transparent in their financial reporting, it's anti-cultural for that organization. So to me, I think the ethics of the whole business environment are really something that can't be delinked from fraudulent financial reporting. So I just wanted to give those observations just in terms of as I think about this topic, and I think we might be better off to think more holistically than narrowly.
Those are very good points, and I think those are the types of things we would hope to tease out in the discussion we have in the breakout sessions. So thank you for that.
Well, I think we've gotten, from a gist of these comments, I think there's emotions on all sides of this. The subject of what should be done regarding fraud, I think, is generated enough interest here that I think we'll have lively conversations this afternoon. And again, the question is, what should we be doing? Is there an issue that we need to attack or not? And looking for all input on that this afternoon. Jessica is going to give some brief commentary about the administration of where we're headed this afternoon. I know, first of all, we're going to lunch, Jessica, and then what time should we be at the meetings and where?
Okay, so lunch will be served in the atrium, and the breakout rooms will be where we normally have lunch. There were 3 there, and then there's one right across near the coats. The breakout rooms are closed to the public, so it will only be SAG members and PCAOB staff and board members. We hope to still start the auditor's reporting model at 1 o'clock, so I'll make this really quick. We are not coming back to this room today. It will be open, so you may leave some of your belongings here if you'd like, but we will reconvene here at 9 a.m. and do a debrief of what we have heard in the breakout sessions for tomorrow, and that is open to the public. And you will most likely be assigned to 2 different breakout rooms, one for auditor's reporting model and one for the fraud discussion. So you will need to take your belongings with you when you change rooms, because our teams will go in there and redo all of the name tags. And there was a 30-minute break between the 2 sessions, and the food for the break will be back in here.
And where are we going after session tonight?
Oh, and then dinner is served at the Madison and for SAG members, and that is at 6:30 is the drinks, and 7:50 is the reception. Sorry, not drinks, reception. And 7:15 is the dinner. All right. If you have any questions, let me know.